Hi, friends. Welcome to Law Chat with Girja. My name is Girja Bhargav Patel. I'm a mother. I'm a wife. I am a podcaster. I am an educator. I am a businesswoman. I am an entrepreneur, and I'm a lawyer. I truly believe in the power of mentorship through storytelling, and that's what Law Chat is all about. So whether you are in 6 months or 10 years of business experience, we can all learn from each other's experiences because we face the same challenges and we have the victories and we have mistakes that we're all making. So why not lean into them and know that we're going to be fine and we're going to be okay and we're going to be inspired. And of course, this is Law Chat with Girja, so we will be talking about some law at some point during the conversation. And if you love what you hear today, which I know you will, then subscribe to Law Chat with Girja and share the love. So grab your coffee, sparkling water, or wine, and let's dive in to the next inspiring mentorship session. Hi friends, welcome to Law Chat. Have you ever taken the role of an educator and then been like, yes, this is wonderful. And then you're just like, wait, I don't know how to educate. I don't know how to teach. What am I getting myself into? I know in the most simplest forms as a mother, teaching my child can be the most frustrating situation I put myself in. And today's guest, Laylee Emadi, is your go-to person to learn, equip, and bridge that gap. She is the educator to educators. She's an educator, a speaker, a podcaster, entrepreneur, and photographer. I personally had an amazing opportunity to meet her this past summer in person and developed a fondness for her and for her message as well. And she speaks so beautifully about diversity, but then also just about how to build your businesses and how to be the educator that you want to be, as well as an entrepreneur alongside that. So welcome to Law Chat. And I am so excited to share her journey with all of you. But then also she is your go-to person in your personal resource library, but then also in your friend circle. So welcome, Laylee. I'm so excited to have you.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here. What a great introduction.
Of course, well-deserved. I mean, over the summer when I met you, I think I've been following you for a while, I guess, on social media and whatnot, but then it's just so nice to actually meet the person that you are following. And, you hear about because you're pretty well known in the creative industry with the different conferences that you've spoken at and the way you teach. And I think it's just so beautiful that you found this gap because a lot of us want to teach, but we just don't know how to.
Yeah, it's been such an interesting journey with that because that's just like the most common thing that I hear is like, I really want to become an educator, but I like don't know how. And it's been fun to kind of bridge the gap.
Yeah. But did you start off as a photographer? Is that where your original career started, or where did you begin?
I actually began as a high school teacher. So that was like my initial career, but my creative career started in photography. And I think that's kind of how everything came full circle with education was that I was coming from like traditional education as my first career and then jumped into the creative industry as a photographer and saw so many people teaching photography, teaching business, but teaching it poorly. Like, I don't say that to throw shade or to say like, oh, they're such bad people. They just didn't know how to teach it. They had the content, they had the know-how, but the way they were communicating it was falling flat. And I don't even think that those educators realized it, but I did. And I was like, I think I could help people really learn how to communicate whatever education it is that they want to share with the world in a like better way. And so I just started kind of digging into what that looked like. And it took years, but now that's all I do, which is really awesome.
That is so fantastic. At what grade or what were you teaching when you did start?
Yeah, I taught ninth and 10th grade. I taught English for a while and coached the dance team. And then the last few years in education, I actually taught dance as an elective, like a fine arts. So I taught fine arts, dance, and coached the dance team.
Oh my goodness. So, I mean, you definitely taught a grade that is not necessarily easy to teach.
Yeah.
High schoolers in general, I mean, they're lovely, but at the same time, it's hard to teach it. That too, English. Then dance, which I can absolutely vouch for your dance moves, seen them, awesome. But how long were you teaching at that time? And did you always know you wanted to be a teacher when you became a teacher?
teaching for me was something that, yeah, it was really natural. I didn't go to school for it. I got my alternative certification to teach in Texas, but I've been teaching in some way, shape, or form basically since I was a teenager myself. So I would, teach the littles in the dance studio, or I was always like a teaching assistant in some capacity. Starting in high school, I was a TA through college. I TA'd in college. And then in my first few corporate jobs, I ended up being like the trainer who would train all the new employees. So it just kept coming full circle. Like I always ended up in the teacher role. And then in my last corporate job, I realized like I'm constantly teaching and that's where I'm happiest. I'm not really happy doing the work. I'm happy teaching other people how to do the work. So I went back and got my alt cert, and that's how I ended up in the classroom. And then I taught for about a decade before I ended up going full time into photography. Yeah.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. And so your photography was a side gig that you were doing just for fun. How did you get into that?
Yeah, actually, ironically, that happened with my students. As a dance teacher, I liked photography as a hobby. And so I started taking like the photos for our programs and the photos of our teams. And then that became moms asking me to take photos of their kids, and they like pay me in gift cards to Starbucks or Target or whatever. And then really quickly, I was like, okay, I'm kind of an all or nothing person, and I jump in really quickly. And so I was like, you know what? I'm just going to like make this a little side gig. So made a website, got a bank account, like all within a year of this happening. And it just kind of escalated from there. And then I kind of a few years later was like, I have a full-time photography client roster, and I have a full-time job, and I'm coaching dance. Like I can't do it all. So
right.
Yeah.
So was it a hard transition to make that decision?
Oh my gosh, it was like one of the hardest decisions I've ever made. I love teaching. I don't think I ever started my photography business thinking like, oh, my dream is to go full time. And I know that's the case for a lot of people, but it wasn't for me. I just thought like, what a fun way to make some extra money and like be creative. And, I have summers free anyway, for the most part, and holidays and things like that. So I didn't think of it as like a long-term goal or a plan. And then once I had that decision to make, it was super difficult. But, every year it got easier after being out of the classroom. It was really hard the first few years. I was like, I can always go back. Like I miss it. I can go back if I want. And then every year it's just gotten easier and easier to be like, no, I made the right choice.
Yeah. And then what was the main thing that helped you like make that final decision? Like, okay, I'm ripping the Band-Aid. I'm going to become, the photographer that I want to be.
Oh gosh, for me, it was honestly just burnout. I was exhausted. Like I did it the wrong way in some ways, that I let it get to the point of like no return. I was so tired all the time. And I remember, it was like right before spring break, and I was waking up. I had like, my husband thought I had like an allergic reaction to something. I had like these really dark circles under my eyes, and I was like, no, I'm just tired. Like I'm fine.
Oh, yeah.
But I was just, working myself into the ground, and I realized like something has to go. And I just thought to myself, photography could go and it would be fine. But if there was ever a time for me to take this leap, it would be now, because I've got a bunch of demand. I've got a lot of clients. Like now's the time to try this. And if it doesn't work out, I can always go back to teaching. I have my teaching certificate. It's not going to expire. It'll be fine. So yeah, that's kind of, I waited a little bit too long, but that's what helped make that decision.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think like what you're talking about, there's a lot of people that are in that position more often than not, where you're not stuck, but you're still clinging onto something that you're used to, that you're familiar with. And then you want to go to another place that seems interesting, seems exciting. It also seems like full interest is happening over there too. So some people just do it right away. They rip the Band-Aid off, or they'll prepare a little bit. So was there any preparations that were happening behind the scenes that was getting you ready for that transition?
Yeah, for sure. Mostly honestly, financially, I did a lot of saving in advance. I wanted to make sure like that I could still contribute to our household, because I'm married, but like everything we did was based off of both of our salaries. So, I did a lot of savings. I did enough to basically get me through to potentially the next school year in case I needed to like go back to teaching. I mean, mentally, I think I didn't really have a chance to actually prepare because I was so exhausted and so burnt out. But logistically, financially, we did, I saved up enough to basically get me through without, even if like worst case scenario, I didn't book any new clients for like 6 months, I would be okay.
Mhm.
And then the cool thing about, or not, I guess it's not cool, but the interesting thing about quitting teaching or like resigning from your position as a teacher is I did it so early on. I did it way before the school year was over so that I could fill my position, because my position at my school is so unique with being the dance coach. There was only one of us at every high school.
Mm-hmm.
So we needed to be able to fill that position. I wanted to be I'm such a control freak. I wanted to be involved in filling the position.
Oh, wow.
So I had a few months of salary still coming in. Like I told them I was done, I think in March, and it wasn't until like August or September that my paycheck stopped coming. So it worked out.
Yeah, that's actually really well planned also. And it was where you're also exiting in a way where you're happy, everybody is happy. There's no negative space that's happening. So then you were doing photography for a while. And then how did you start getting back into the teaching like business, but now for educators?
Yeah, this was an interesting little winding road. So I was doing photography, quit teaching. And then about 6 months in, I started teaching photography to like moms that I had like taught their kids, or like they'd have like a mother-daughter date and I teach them how to use their camera. And it basically, I was teaching this like intro to photography class. And that was like my first foray into like the creative world and educating and just finding how it's different and how it's the same. And then that turned into teaching business to budding photographers. So new photographers who didn't know what they were doing. I would teach them photography, but really I was mostly teaching them how to run a business. And that turned into workshops, and that turned into retreats, and then that turned into speaking. And then everything kind of flipped, and I started teaching the more experienced entrepreneur how to like step into education and leadership. And then my course was born. And then that's just kind of like what I do now.
I think, but that is such a cool evolution of your timeline. But then also there's so much that happened before you came to this stage also.
Yeah.
And so what were some of the challenges though that you experienced? Because I feel like what you're doing wasn't, even though there's educators and there's a degree to educate and all that stuff, but what you're doing is pretty different and there's not many of you out there. And so what were some challenges that you might have faced because it was something different, something new? I hate to interrupt this awesome conversation, but I have to stop and talk with you about the number one thing I'm asked about by entrepreneurs: contracts. They're vital to any business relationship and to protect your business. But I also know that entrepreneurs, especially when you're starting up, money is tight. But I would never want you to compromise on a strong legal foundation. So enter yourcontractbuddy.com, a website created by me with contract templates created and drafted by me and fellow industry partners. They're ready to use and easy to plug in immediately. And they are not restricted to any specific state. So yourcontractbuddy.com is sponsoring this episode, and you and your listener can get 10% off right now with code LAWCHAT. Yes, you heard me right. 10% off right now with code LAWCHAT. And now back to our awesome conversation.
Yeah. I mean, I still think I somewhat face some of these challenges today, but it's a little bit less post 2020 because so many people were kind of forced to pivot, and people were then, I feel like then a lot of educators were kind of like forced to teach their people how to pivot, even if they didn't want to. But to backtrack to the beginning of that, like when I started teaching creative entrepreneurs how to educate, it was not happening anywhere. Like I didn't see anybody teaching that. You see people teaching like coaches or life coaches, but you don't really see people teaching like an everyday mentor or an everyday like workshop host or conference host or course creator. There are courses to create courses, but there's not really somebody teaching you how to teach it. So anyway, all that to say, it was kind of hard because I was starting completely from scratch. Whereas I think most people who create education have some kind of like foundation that they've taken that they can then like recreate in some way or put their own spin on. So that was hard. I think it got even more difficult when I saw people kind of in 2020 say, okay, I can help you educate too, but they still weren't teaching the thing that was missing. They're still just teaching like marketing, which I teach, like, don't market first, learn how to educate first, then market. So then I'm kind of having to do a little bit of like re-educating of people who are getting the wrong information. So that's been a struggle that I still am dealing with, or that I'm still working through with a lot of my students. Those are probably my biggest ones. We're just kind of like not having anybody and having to kind of explain to everybody this like meta concept that I've come up with that people are not trained to understand the value of. So I'm having to kind of show the value and teach the value and teach the content. It's been a weird thing, but the cool thing is I'm like super passionate about it, so I can talk about it all day.
Yeah.
Which I have to do. But it's good.
But I think you've said something really important, that a lot of times, there's so many of us that are paving new paths, that are adding something different to the norm. And in order for people to even know that they need it, you have to educate them. You can't market it unless they know that they need it. So education is a form of marketing also, but it is where you're just adding so much value to their life and they didn't even know they needed that value. And so I feel like we sometimes miss that. And we're trained, a lot of us in school, especially in college, you're trained to just take. You're not trained to give. I went to business school. We were not trained to give. We were trained to take and literally optimize on our relationships.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like different. And I remember when I first encountered the creative community, I was so floored by the concept of giving. Not that I wasn't a giver, but like it was just so different from what I have been taught in my educational life. So I think what you're saying is very important, that it does start with education when you're doing something different, especially not just what everybody else is doing.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think people hear education and they have like a concept of what that is, but really you're educating, and no matter what you do, you have to educate in some capacity. So.
And it's value given. And I think there's so much merit to all of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so I feel like you're more seasoned in whatever you have been doing, and you have a retreat. Do you still do the retreat also?
I do. Yeah. It's once a year, the next level retreat. So it's great.
That's awesome. And around what time of the year do you do that?
So typically it's been in the fall until we postponed 2020 and then did that postponement in the spring, but we'll go back to fall next year.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. And I actually had, over the summer, we were at the Creative at Heart conference, and you spoke so beautifully about diversity. And I also clearly am from a diverse background. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that, because I know that sometimes we kind of glaze over some of those things just because we're here, we've done it, we've accomplished, and that's not something that's pulled us back. But I really wanted to hear from you also some of the things that you face outside of the regular norms that we normally face in business, with, challenges with our market and, business growth challenges that we might have, or, all those things, but other aspects that people of diverse backgrounds might face.
Yeah. I mean, I think probably one of the biggest struggles that I faced just from a like diversity and inclusivity kind of standpoint was seeing, when I first entered the creative community, seeing the people on stage all kind of look the same, and none of them really looked like me or like anybody else who was of a diverse background. And that's changed a lot over the past, 9 or 10 years. But the first conference I ever went to, literally every single speaker looked the same. And it wasn't like, I'm not even just talking like they were white or they were blonde, but it's like they were Christian, they were white, they were blonde, they were in their early 20s and I was not. And it's just like literally everything about them was like a carbon copy, which is fine. But there was like nothing in there to kind of show me like there's space for you in the leadership of this community, or like there's space for you in the, innovative changes that could happen within this industry, because the people at the top are all kind of the same. And so it's probably best if you just kind of stay where you're at. And so that was definitely a mental block. And of course, this is like rooted in upbringing and culture and, societal norms. And we're both in Texas. I'm in Dallas. And it's like, of course, like that my history of being kind of the odd one out was of course there present, but it was all things that I had to work through that I don't think a lot of people had to work through who were my peers in the creative industry. And so that was a really interesting, I think, first like 5 years in the industry of having to basically like give myself a pep talk every day of like, just because you're different doesn't mean you're not valuable. Just because you don't look the same or act the same or think the same or have the same ideology doesn't mean that you don't have like something to give to the industry that's different, or you can't take some kind of leadership position or role. Like these things are not related, but it's really hard when you're seeing, when there's lack of representation, I think it's really difficult for anybody to be able to put themselves into like the position that they want to get to.
I completely agree. So how did you make that space for yourself?
I think I just got really tired of it. Honestly, I think I just was like, you know what? I'm going for it because I'm going to force my way in. And I kind of did. I will say huge credit to Natalie Frank and the Rising Tide Society. That was like probably the first thing that I saw in the creative community a few years in pop up and say like one of our tenets is diversity, like one of the things that we believe in. Right. And I didn't see that before. And frankly, I'm very lucky, and I'll never like discount or discredit this, that Natalie is a good friend of mine. And as my friend, she really worked hard to bring me up. Like she used her position, she leveraged her already standing leadership in the photography and the creative industry to lift up people like me who otherwise probably wouldn't have had the chance. And so that was really interesting because that's not something I ever asked her for, but kind of like we're taught in business school and I was a communications major. So all my classes were in the business school, but you're taught like leverage your relationships.
Yeah.
And I never really did that, but she really did that for me. So props to her and to the Rising Tide Society as a whole and Honeybook who backs them. But until then, it was really just like me kind of being scrappy and fighting for a seat at the table. And I love the saying, build your own table, like stop waiting for a seat. But I kind of wanted to do both. Like I built my own table, but I also wanted to be like, you're going to let me into this table. Like, I'm sitting with you.
Gosh, I'm totally on if I'm just going to build my own table and have lots of seats around it. Like that's just how it is. And it's always been that way in the sense of and it's not just with, cultural differences, even with your own little community, there can be like a space where they're like, no, there's no space for you here. And you're like, okay, fine. I don't care. I'll make my own space. Like, I don't need you to thrive. So I think that is really true there. And then Natalie Frank, she was one of my first guests on my show. She's such an amazing human. And her episode was so, again, very like chills type, it's just so good. And I agree. There has been such a force that is coming through that. I don't know about you, but for me, sometimes, when I was born in DC, I lived there for like 12 years of my life. And then we moved here to Houston. Well, Baytown, not even Houston, Baytown, Texas, which is 30 minutes away from Houston. I loved it. I love it, but you can definitely feel the difference between Houston and Baytown. Like the Southern drawl is so prominent over there and evident. Meanwhile, in Houston, you just have a lot of different accents happening just because it's such a melting pot of cultures here. But I went to a school that, again, I would not change anything because it was so beautiful there. But I was the only Indian in that school, but for my brother who joined like later on, because he was still a child when we moved. And I remember being the person, well, one, I was from the East Coast. So it was just like, okay. Like all these questions would come my way. Then I was like Indian. I actually had someone ask me the first year, so what tribe are you from? And I was like, huh, this is very interesting. So then I played along with it because I thought this was so funny. Because I came from a place where there was lots of diplomat kids. And so there was lots of diversity happening over there. And then I go to Baytown, Texas. And so I actually had this one person. I was just like, I made up some stuff. And then finally I'm like, no, actually I'm Indian from like India. My heritage is that. I'm actually American nationality. Let's be clear on all of this. I always took those moments as teaching moments just because I felt like they're really coming from a place of lack of knowledge. Again, educating and teaching somebody from where you are, your perspectives also, which I think can be applicable not just to skin color and culture, but also to just diverse ideologies and beliefs and religions. So it's incredible to like have that. It was really cool to hear you talk about it, even like in your high school when you had the dance team and things like that, and being that person who just kind of stood out. But I also think there is so much, if you take it in a way that's positive, then you can really leverage it also in the sense of, what, I'm going to teach you about my culture, but also I'm going to now create a space for myself while I'm doing that and become the authority on what I'm telling you.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I think, I don't know, maybe you've seen this too, but I have a lot of friends. I feel like, especially like immigrant families tend to find each other. And so I have a lot of friends who I would see, outside of school who were, Iranian, just like I am. And I've seen them, we've all grown up together. And I've seen some of us really like embrace that role of like, I mean, it's just the burden that we have to bear to like teach people what we are. Like, we're not all terrorists. We're not all like, like things that are like, you think would go without saying, but they just don't. And some of us have coped a little bit better. And some of us have kind of gone to like a really bitter, kind of angry place, which you can't, I mean, I completely validate their feelings. I understand that response, but it's been interesting to see what happens when somebody leans into like the possibilities of like, okay, I can teach these people, I can try to make an impact, I can try to change a mind here and there. It is exhausting for sure, but I definitely see the benefit to doing that versus just kind of like letting that resentment build up and not being able to kind of like take a minute and at least like try. Now I will say like sometimes it gets a little exhausting. Some people are not worth trying with, but in general, I found like most people are pretty responsive, and it's really just a place, like you said, of like not knowing any better.
Yeah. I think, absolutely. I agree with you. I think there's, the bitterness and the anger that usually comes from the fact that you aren't being treated as a human. It's kind of like you're treated as less than, or you feel like you're treated as less than. It may not be the situation, but that's how you're feeling also. And it's hard at times to shift that focus. But I also think that if you don't, then that's going to be overshadowing everything, like that chip on the shoulder for no reason. And it may not always be the reason why you couldn't go to the next level. Sometimes it is actual based on merit, why you didn't go to the next level for whatever reason. But it's very important, like you said, to kind of shift the focus and the lens of it and see it in a different light. Now, for those of, diversity has become a big issue in 2020. It really was something that was highlighted, and a lot of different companies also started putting DEI people in there and, actually having rules for those specific issues and matters. What are some tips that you could give to business owners, whether you're a small company or a big company, on how to really integrate diversity and inclusion into your business?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that I would say that you could really tactically do is just make sure that you're educated on what that even means. I think a lot of times people have an idea of what it means to have a diverse company or represent a diverse company. And what that ends up kind of looking like is suspiciously like tokenism. And so I think just getting educated and seeking out education from people who are actually qualified to give that education. So just like anything else that's like a huge trend on social media, you'll have people who are out there kind of running their mouths, but they don't have the credentials to back it up. And they're maybe giving you misinformation, but you trust what they're saying because you want to just believe that like the person who's talking to you is telling you the truth. So I always say like err on the side of find an expert, learn from them. So a DEI expert. The second thing I would say is just making sure that you have in some way, shape or form in your company representation. So something I run into a lot with my students is, you know, like, let's say I'm Susie Q, I'm a coach, but I'm white, I'm white Christian, middle America, whatever. How do I have representation in my business when I am my business and I don't have a team? Like, let's say I don't have a team. I'm not hiring anybody in. So it's not like I can hire in people of color. What am I doing? And I always say, just like, look at who you're working with, look at who you're talking to. If you have a podcast, who is on your podcast? If you're on podcast, what podcast are you pitching yourself to? Like, there's so many people that we interact with on a daily basis. I think just being able to like audit, who am I talking to? And could I broaden that a little bit is a really good, like, tactical place to start.
I agree. Other couple tips could also be just the message that you're sending out on your social media, and then also your website, the kind of photographs that you're using, the kind of verbiage you're using, also how inclusive are those, the language. And it's not to be like you don't have to be like this hypersensitive inclusivity, but you know, it's just being in generically just inclusive in that, even the photographs that you use on your website, especially for those solopreneurs out there that are just wondering, how do I do this? And of course, not make it it should be intentional, but not intentional where it starts looking like the token diverse person. Like that also is when you're looking at it and others are looking at it, it's quite obvious. I would also maybe even go a step further, and you know, with the DEI hiring that expert, they would also probably share with you on how you can create systems in your business that are so benign and generic in nature. It's not targeting any specific group of people or types of people, unless you are specifically doing that for advertising purposes. But so, you know, there are many different things, but of course, education is number one again, and hiring the right person to help you in your business. I know so many small business owners that have done it, and they've actually just gone in for the education themselves. It's not just reading and seeing social media, but actually physically sitting in a group of people where somebody's teaching you about it. And another way of educating yourself is traveling. Go explore, go expose yourself to different cultures, enjoy their food, even if it's within your Houston, like for example, Houston, Dallas, my gosh, the culinary scene is like next level. How much can you explore through that? And even simple things like watching Netflix and watching different cultural movies and shows to understand their cultures, because there is a lot of culture that plays into the way people interact with one another and the way they interact in situations also.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I always joke like, we don't have a lot in Dallas, but we have a lot of food. So that was a really great point, because I feel like we do have like food from every culture and background you could possibly want. And so maybe stop going to Chick-fil-A every day and go somewhere else for life.
Just try it out.
I mean, no shame. Like I love
There's no shame in the Chick-fil-A game. Like totally, I get it. I absolutely adore. I'm vegetarian, but I adore like all the vegetarian stuff that they have. But with that being said, try something new out, even if it's scary. You may or may not like it, but you've tried it. You can actually then have a knowledgeable conversation with somebody about that experience rather than just speaking from what you assume it to be or you've heard it to be. And there's so much power to experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like a lot of times like those restaurants are owned by families who like immigrated here, and they like my favorite ramen place here, it's literally one guy who just is like an older gentleman, and his like, I don't know, nephew, like one of his family members is the waiter, and there's literally two people that work there, the chef and then the waiter, and they're definitely family and they're definitely immigrant, and it's just fun to like talk with them and like see like, where did you come from? How did you bring this here? How did you end up in a suburb of Dallas? Like,
yeah.
so cool.
Yeah. And you're right. They're small businesses. and they are really contributing to the economy of your city and your state as well. So it's really cool to see them thrive and also to be supportive of them.
Yeah.
I completely agree with you. I agree. Though I love that you were so bold to have that conversation, and because it sparked so many other conversations post presentation in our like subgroups. And they're hard conversations to have, especially with people who don't normally have those conversations or have maybe never experienced what you were talking about even. And so, but it was beautiful because at least in my group, we were able to have very healthy conversations. And again, a space to educate others with our own personal experiences. So I feel like the theme of this entire interview has been education. And I know that that's what you do. And so if for us, I'm going to kind of like switch gears now. And for those of us, like I'm a lawyer, and that's where my practice has been. My personal education has been there, even though I did business undergrad. I've never learned to teach though. And so whatever teaching that comes out of me is literally just stuff, right? And if my teaching to my child is representative is terrible, like no one should see me do that. It's so bad. I like lose patience so quickly. I'm like,
that's very common with parents.
like, okay. Why don't you get this? I feel so bad for them. But for those of us that are trying to get into the whole, not get in, but by default, also organically, we're just in that space where we're trying to tell people like, hey, listen, this is needed, or this is important, or paving a new path. What are some tips that you could give us on just the basics of education?
Oh gosh, I could talk about this for like an hour. Let me think. So I think first off, the biggest piece of advice I can give anybody who by nature just wants to educate or just has like a message to share or feels really passionate about something, is to just try your very best to meet your audience and your people where they are. Like, because I think one thing that happens very commonly with people who are very excited about a topic is you talk about it the way that you understand it. And I think that that's where huge disconnect happens, because the people you're talking to generally probably don't have the background that you have in that topic. So for example, if you were going to teach somebody something about the law, they probably have no idea. You're going to have to like bring it way down. And that can be really hard for people who are passionate about what they're talking about. So I know I have one student who created a course on like a specific photography skill. And I had to keep telling her like, this information is awesome, but you're assuming that the people who are taking this content in already know all of these extra steps that you know, but they probably don't know it. So I think one huge thing that a lot of people miss the mark on is just understanding that they need to meet their students or the people who are consuming their content where they're at and not where you are at, which is, I think, just like comes with practice for sure.
Yeah, that's huge actually, to bring it to the level that is understandable by your audience. It's like, I don't know about you, but I've sat in like those classes in undergrad or even like, later on. And I'm just like, I'm sitting there for this major of mine. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what are you talking? What is happening? Like, I don't understand a word that's coming out of your mouth right now.
Yeah. You're like, you missed like 3 things I have never heard of, but that's fine.
Yeah. And then you're like, oh my gosh, I know this is gonna be on the final. Like, what am I gonna do?
Yeah. Yeah. It's crazy. So that would be one thing. Another thing I think is just like making sure that you're continually taking in some kind of education yourself. I think that oftentimes we get to a point in our businesses or our careers or wherever, and we think like, okay, we're good, we're set, we're comfortable. And we stop investing in our own continued education. And while I've made some very big mistakes recently with the investments that I've made, at least I'm making them. Like, at least I'm trying to find something new to invest in. And sometimes you miss the mark, but you learn from that mistake and you go and you make a new investment. And, like there has been probably like total just a few months out of the 9 years that I've run this business that I've not been a member of some type of educational, experience or platform or, like coaching or whatever it is. So right now I'm in a mastermind. I run a mastermind, but I'm in a mastermind too. And before that, I was in a group coaching program that did not go well, but that's okay because I tried it out.
Yeah.
So I think just like making sure that you're constantly continuing your own education and not just working toward teaching other people.
I completely agree with you because what you might have learned might have become antiquated also. And so, aside from surrounding yourself with other people who are on the same mindset level of you, I think another thing is just to literally, if you have continuing education in your industry, go do that ever so often. Read journal articles or, publishing, like whatever's published out there for your industry or for whatever your line of expertise is, so that you're staying abreast of what's new and hot.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, on top of everything else, like sometimes we can't make like big investments, but I love that you brought up like reading journal articles and things like that, listening to podcasts like this.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, this is a way to, it's like free content just sitting there. Like you're not losing anything by taking it in.
Podcasts are such like amazing pieces of education. Pick a podcast that inspires you. Pick a podcast that empowers you. I remember when I first was but when I was dabbling into the whole, let me start my law practice this way, let me start doing this way. Podcast was my source of education, but also my source of inspiration. Yeah. And I wasn't listening to legal podcasts by any means because that was just drab for me. But what I was listening to was the industry that I'm serving. I was listening to those podcasts because it brought in so much inspiration, but then also it gave me ideas on how I could be more helpful to that community. And it was just like, there's just so much education out there that's free.
Yeah.
And so take advantage of that. You don't have to be a part of a mastermind or something like that. Although those are wonderful and I absolutely am part of them and I think they're amazing. But if you can't, that's okay too. There's other ways.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like there's something out there for everyone and for whatever season everybody is in. So if somebody can't really afford to make like, a $10,000 investment right now, like that's okay. You can just take in some free content while you get to the point of being ready to make another investment.
Yeah. And one last question about like an educator tip is, what's a good tip for delivering the message? I mean, sometimes that can be really tough and that can be the challenge. I mean, I feel like maybe like sometimes when I'm talking, I'm like, are you listening? Is this helpful? Like what's happening?
Oh my gosh. So delivery of content is like something I, again, could talk forever on, but just to kind of pinpoint what you said about like, is this actually like getting to the person the way that I want it to, is learning how to pick up on like the other person's context clues, basically. So you're looking at body language. If you have them in front of you, it's a little bit easier because you're looking at body language, even from the stage. And this is something that, again, I just want to emphasize, I think comes with practice, but being able to switch gears really quickly, I think is a really important skill to start working toward if you ever want to be able to address people, not just one-on-one, but from the stage, in small groups, no matter what this setting is, but being able to shift gears, because sometimes you do prepare content that does not land with your audience and you need to be able to be like, okay, I'm shifting right now. And that can be really difficult. Some people need scripts. Some people need to have like things memorized. And I feel like the best educators get up there that the content that you are an expert in. So just kind of pushing aside like the need for scripted, memorized content and just relying on like, is the person sitting there with their arms folded, kind of like gazing around and not really focused on what I'm saying? I stopped worrying about phones and stuff. I feel like a lot of people are like, are they on their phones? People take notes on their phones now. People are like Instagramming a picture of you. You don't even know what they're doing. I wouldn't worry about that. But I kind of look more at like body language and are they like dialed in? Are they focused or are they just kind of like wandering and not really taking in anything you're saying. And if it's one or two people, it's not a big deal. But if it's like the majority, then it might be time to make a quick shift.
Yeah.
And whenever I do make that quick shift, I just try to really rely on like, okay, what's another approach I can take, or another story I can tell, or another anecdote that will pull people back in. So I think that's kind of like a personal style choice, but for me, it tends to like be on the comedic side. I tend to like crack a lot of jokes, or like, I use like a lot of self-deprecating humor, and that tends to get people back in, because who doesn't like to like laugh at somebody else? It's just,
Oh, but that's true though. And I love that tip of yours, that find a way to reel them back in. And you can definitely think about those tips beforehand. It's not something that you have to be like, you don't have to be on the stage to think about it, but have some of those tips in your tool belt. Like, okay, so if this happens, then I can share this story or this anecdote, or let me just make fun of myself in this way, or, whatever. And so that way you're prepared, even with the shift of the gears that are happening at that time. Those have been all amazing, tips today that you've shared. And I love our conversation about diversity also. Thank you so much for sharing all of this amazing wisdom. Normally, I always do this. I always forget to ask about the legal aspect of your business, or, things that you're like, oh man, I wish I knew that. Is there anything that you could share with us
about the legal aspect of my business? I
guess,
guess,
like, oh, I wish I'd done that beforehand, or I did this and I'm so proud of myself.
Okay, so probably something I wish I had done sooner is figuring out what I wanted to trademark versus what I don't, because I'm in that process right now. I will say I'm in a very unique situation because my husband is an attorney. So from the first day, he was like, get a contract. So like, I never went through that same like growing pain of like, I don't have contracts, because Tim was always like, you better get this together.
Yeah.
But I think aside from that, just like making sure that everything is above board and everything is in writing and everything is constantly like, the minute before I take money from anyone, there's a contract signed. Right. Is probably like the biggest thing, especially because I do think that in terms of education, a lot of people don't do that. So a lot of photographers will use contracts, but then they'll take a mentoring session and they won't have one. And so that's like a huge red flag. But yeah, that's probably the biggest legal thing I could share.
No, and I love that you already had the contracts in place. And I think you're right. There are times when people say, well, we had this one contract, so it covers everything, but it doesn't. And sometimes it can be very confusing. And so it's better to just get all of that stuff, in order, even if you think it's very minuscule in your business. Like, you need it. Like, we need to take attention to that.
Yeah. Especially when there's like money being exchanged. It's just super important.
Awesome. So how can we connect with you? How can we reach out and say hi, or just follow you and all your amazingness that you spread?
Yeah, I love chatting on Instagram, probably like everybody else in the world. I'm just at Laylee_Emadi. There's not a lot of Laylees out there, so I'm pretty easy to find. Or you can find me on my website, LayleeEmadi.com.
Wonderful. I'm going to have all the links on our show notes as well. And before we wrap it up, what is one of your favorite books?
Oh gosh, let me look behind me. Probably anything Brené Brown is like probably top 5 for me. Braving the Wilderness is probably my favorite of hers. Love that one. And then I also really love Great Marketers Tell Story, or I think it's like, it says like great marketers are liars, and then it crosses it out and it says tell stories, and it's just really great marketing read.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I'm going to have links to all of that again in the show notes. Thank you so much for being with us today and sharing all of your wisdom. As usual, love chatting with you.
Thank you. It was so much fun.
Thank you so much for joining Law Chat with Girja. I just love these kind of conversations that are motivating, inspiring, but truthful, raw, and honest about all of the challenges, all of the victories, all of the triumphs, picking ourselves back up again. I just can't think of a better way to get mentorship but Law Chat with Girja. If this was helpful to you, or this was inspiring to you, please share the love. You can give this video a thumbs up. You can subscribe to this channel. You can also share this with your community by taking a screenshot and posting it on your social media and tagging GBP Law. When you do that, a lot more people will be able to see this video that not only benefited you, but also can benefit them as well. So let's share that love and let's share that inspiration. And if you want more information about what I do and other resources, go check out gbplaw.com or yourcontractbuddy.com. And I look forward to seeing you next time.